We asked Steph what did the partnership with CYDA enable that you couldn't have done in a university-only project?
Partnering with CYDA gave the project a kind of grounding that I really valued. So there was always a clear so what around developing this report, a real, working with a real organisation like CYDA. They're working with real families, real young people, and there was a genuine need for this resource to actually land and be very, very useful. So there was sort of a very practical element to developing the report. It also gave me a much clearer picture of who we were making this for. So, working with CYDA, who are actually on the ground, working with young people, working with families, meant that the audience never felt abstract to me. And it also kept me accountable in a good way as well. So, having CYDA in the room or me being able to attend meetings or ask questions meant that I was always thinking about the gap between what the data was showing and then what people were actually living and experiencing as well, which is something I try to do often in my academic work. But that tension is very important, and this partnership actually often kept that very front of mind for me. And then on a very practical level, CYDA brought knowledge that I just didn't have. So, what questions was the sector sitting with? What already existed? Where were people hitting walls, trying to find and use this kind of information? And so that was genuinely invaluable to the project, I think.
What is something about disability data you think most people misunderstand?
One assumption I kept coming back to when developing this report was the idea that more data automatically means better understanding of something. And so what I found was that it really depends on the foundations. So if the frameworks or the definitions aren't quite right, or if the right people haven't been involved in shaping that process, more data can actually end up reproducing some of the same gaps at a larger scale rather than really filling them. So there's also something worth sitting with here around the assumption that publicly available data is comprehensive. So the gaps are actually quite substantial. In the publicly available data. And when I say publicly available, that's to sort of people in the general community that might not have academic ties to a university like I do, for example. And so these gaps tend to cluster in particular places. So these are often around the experiences that are hardest to capture, but are certainly most important to understand. And so I think it's really worth naming that data isn't neutral. So even if it can feel that way sometimes, so every data set reflects decisions about what to measure, how to define it, who to ask, and what to do with the answers. And so those decisions are made by people and institutions with particular perspectives, and that shapes what the data can and can't show. So recognising that isn't really necessarily a criticism, it's just part of using the data well and being transparent about what the data can achieve.
What types of data are most needed but hardest to find?
Clearest gaps that I kept coming back to and thinking about when putting together this report and gathering the data and looking at some of the statistics was around longitudinal data. So we have reasonable snapshots of what's happening at particular points in time, but we have very little data that actually follows children and young people with disability through key moments. And those might be moments like leaving school, moving out of home, that kind of thing. And so those transitions are often exactly when things can get very complex for people and have sort of long-term effects on people's lives. And so it feels like that's a real significant absence. There's also a gap around outcomes that actually matter to people. So this is something that certainly working with CYDA has illuminated for me, and in some of my in some of the work that I do, the qualitative work that I do, and some of those things that matter to people around quality of life, social connection, having a say in how you live. Those are things that people will often talk about rather than just service use or clinical measures. And so we don't have very good sort of measures or data on those things that matter to people. And those things are definitely harder to capture, but they're often what people are most concerned about, which I think important to acknowledge. And then there's a question of who's really falling outside of the systems that we do have data on. So children and young people who aren't on the NDIS, for example, who aren't in mainstream education, who are in contact with the justice system, they often don't show up in administrative data, which means that their experiences can be really hard to see from a policy perspective. And I think one of the things that I'd love to see more of is data on barriers. So not just participation rates, but the why behind that and those rates. So what people tried, what didn't work, where they hit walls, and that context is often missing and is often very essential.